Hello. The Divine Code reading for April 4th, pages 603 and 604. We are in the chapter Laws of Returning Stolen Objects and Restitution for Theft. Topic number 19. A change of jurisdiction happens only by a sale or gift that is given by the consent of both parties in the transaction. Therefore, if the thief forced the buyer to buy a stolen item, or to take it as repayment for a loan, this is not considered a change of jurisdiction. And even if the owner despaired of recovering the item, it must be returned to him. And it's from from Rima Koshan Mishpat 361.5. Now this is different from, and we're going to learn later on in this unit. If a person forces the purchase, if someone forces someone else to sell him an item, somebody likes his neighbor's garden gnome, and he goes over and he just harasses the neighbor over and over again until he sells him the garden gnome, and he pays the neighbor the $20 or whatever the fair price is for the item. He can then that would be considered a valid transaction, because the neighbor finally agreed. And it's not allowed to do that through the Jewish law of coveting, which doesn't necessarily affect non-Jews the same way. But in either case, it would be considered a valid purchase at that point. This is the other side of the transaction. If someone forces another person to accept something, and because cash is cash, and a person gets cash and they can use it for many different things. If a person forces someone to take something, like some neighbor comes over and says, "Hey, I owe you $20, but I don't have $20, so I'm going to give you this garden gnome," and he forces it on the guy, that would not be considered a valid transaction. So in the case of theft, the question is whether or not the stolen object changes ownership at that point. And if it's a forced purchase, a forced sale could be considered valid, but a forced purchase would not be considered valid. Therefore, if a second thief stole the item from the first thief, and the item is still intact, so this is a similar case, and the second thief takes the item. In either case, it hasn't changed venue. It hasn't changed ownership to the new person, and therefore it would still need to be returned intact to the original owner. Even if, and it still must be returned to the owner, even if he has previously despaired of recovering it. So in the case where the original owner has given up hope, that's the laws work one way in that case. And in the case where the owner has not given up hope of recovering it, the laws operate differently in that case. However, in the case where the object is still in the possession of the original thief, or it's in his hands, and if it goes to another person, it hasn't really changed venue in these two cases, either theft or a forced purchase by the third party. It hasn't changed, and therefore it's still, even if the owner has not despaired, if the owner had despaired, it would still be required to be returned. Well, and that's also Shogunora Kosher Mishpat, chapter 361. Is also clear from Rambam Laws of Robbery 117. Topic number 20. If the buyer of a stolen object has not acquired it with the change of jurisdiction, since the owner did not despair. So in this case, the owner did not despair. He expects to get it back. It's a normative purchase. It's not a forced purchase or a theft. It's a normative purchase. You know, someone took the object down to the marketplace and sold it like any other object gets sold at the marketplace. So the owner is still hoping to get it back. Therefore, it's not considered a valid purchase by whoever bought it. Even if he destroys the object or loses it through his negligence, or if he sends it to a second buyer, then the owner can make a demand in court to be paid for the stolen item, either from the thief or the first buyer. So if the person, so in this case, somebody buys an object at the market. They don't know if it's stolen or not, in this case. And they could be forced, if they lost the object, or they're through negligence, not that they purposely changed it, but through negligence. In this case, it's a question of whether or not the buyer, the innocent buyer, could be sued for the value of the item by the original owner. And Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg notes that this law is derived from Tractate Bava Kama 111b. If one stole from the owner, and the owner did not yet despair, and another person consumed the stolen item, the owner can demand payment either from the thief or from the second person. Rabbi Rashba Mordecai and Miri on Tractate Bava Kama 111b explain that as long as the owner has not despaired, even if an unsuspecting buyer from the thief is liable for any damage that occurs to the item. So if the owner did not despair, and the owner would first go to the thief and try to get payment for the restitution for the damage, he can, if that doesn't work, he can now go to the buyer, the unsuspecting buyer, and demand that he be reimbursed for the item if the item had been lost, or if the item had been lost, or through negligence, or it been, well, in the footnote is referring to being consumed, but that would be more of a purposeful change. In this situation, the first buyer has removed the owner's jurisdiction from the item. For example, the owner despaired after the first buyer acquired the item. But before he sold it to the second buyer, so the second buyer fully acquires the item with the owner's despair and the charge and the change of jurisdiction. Even though the first buyer is not a thief, and even if he had no idea the item was stolen, nevertheless, since the item is not his, he is responsible for the loss that he has caused. So in this case, the owner, the person that purchased the item at the market, as long as the owner is not despaired for the item, he does not acquire the item. He has a guardianship responsibility for the item. And if it's damaged, in that he has a responsibility towards the original owner. See. Makade Ephraim Laws of Robbery, Chapter 1 discusses that. In this situation, what amount does the first buyer of the stolen item owe the victim of the theft? He must pay for the part of the value that is over and above what the thief is obligated to pay. The thief must reimburse the owner in place of returning the stolen object, since it is no longer in the thief's jurisdiction. For example, if the thief stole an item worth $100 and it appreciated in value and is now worth $120 before he sells it to the buyer, the buyer then destroys it and causes the value to decrease. then the thief must pay the owner $100 and the buyer must pay him $20. It is impossible for the owner to demand payment from the thief. If it is impossible for the owner to demand payment from the thief, he can demand the whole sum from the buyer. This only applies if the buyer intended to acquire the stolen item. Okay, so so the thief is required to reimburse for the stolen item. And if the owner had, there's a number of moving parts here. If the owner had not despaired before the sale, and if I'm reading this correctly, the item changed value before the theft. It would seem to might be the item changed value after the theft, but after the sale. So the question of what is owed to the original owner by the thief and by the subsequent buyer. And if it was worth $100, then the thief owes the buyer $100. If it changed in value, and I would suggest that that's before, it'd be after the sale. It's not clear in here if it's before or after the sale. It says before. That's worth $120 before he sells it to the buyer. So the thief is required to pay back the $100 that the original, at the time of theft, the item was valued. The buyer would have to pay back the increased value that occurred between the time of theft until the sale. And if the thief, it cannot be, and this is if the item was damaged or was changed, would be the word, would make more sense. If the item was changed under negligence or under not purposely, is what I'm speaking of here, then the new owner would pay the difference in price of what it appreciated. And if the new owner knew it was a stolen item, so if the new owner, in the case where they cannot get the money from the thief, the $100, the thief cannot reimburse the $100. So they're going to go to the new owner, the guy who purchased the item, and ask him for the entire $120. If the new owner, if the purchaser knew that it was stolen, then he has he is an accomplice to the thief, and that makes him responsible for, he's like co-signing the thief's obligation. And then he, because he's part of it, would have to pay the principal as well as any increase. If the person did not know, if he's an honest person, but he purchased a stolen object by not knowing, then he's only responsible for any change in value between the time that it was stolen and the time that he purchased the item. However, if a second person only intentionally damaged the stolen item, for example, he ate stolen food that the thief gave to him, or if the second thief stole it from the first thief, he has not acquired it legally, whether or not he knew the item had been stolen. Even if he intended to acquire the item for himself, but he did not wish to receive it legally, and therefore he is merely a damager. Therefore, if the item has a permanent change while in the jurisdiction of the second person by which he acquires it, or if he loses it even by his own negligence, or if he eats it or ruins it in some other way, then since the victim of the theft did not despair of recovering the object at the time it was changed or lost, that's discussed in Nivot HaMishpat, Kosher Mishpat 361.3, it still belongs to the victim. In that case, the second person who damaged the item, after he receives it, buys it, or steals it from the thief, is considered as if he himself had stolen it from the owner. Therefore, the owner can demand full payment for the thief either from the first thief or the second person. Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg notes that it appears that if the object was changed, it depends on the argument between the Kidzok HaKosham and the Nivot HaMishpat, as explained in an earlier footnote. So, if it had changed venue, if it had changed its name, so to speak, the name, the essence of the object had changed, so it's no longer what the thief owned. Then, if that's done by the third party, whether it's a person who bought it at the marketplace or a thief who stole the item, who would have restolen the item, that person would be responsible with regard to the changed object, which is very similar to the earlier. If it had changed venue, or it had changed essence, it changed its name, is what it's called. That's similar to if it had been damaged. And okay, so apparently the damaging, when it's referring to the damaging in the earlier paragraph, that's referring to an item that had been damaged but had not had its essence stolen. Its name had not changed. So it's a cup that had been chipped, but it's still considered a cup, versus a cup that is smashed and it's no longer considered a cup. In either case, assuming that the owner had not despaired of recovering the item, then the new thief or the person who purchased it, either on purpose or inadvertently purchased a stolen object, would be responsible for the object, or have some shared responsibility with the thief for the value of the object. If, however, the owner despaired, so all the stuff before was if the owner was still hoping to get it back. If the owner was still hoping to get it back at the time that it was either stolen by a third person or was sold to a third person, if the owner expected it back at that time, then he should be able to receive. Then the expectation continues on to the third person. Now we're seeing if the owner had despaired, so he did not expect to get it back. The person stole the object. A month later, the owner despairs, and 2 months after the theft, the thief sells it or has it stolen from him, then it would not extend to the third person. If, however, the owner despaired of recovering the object before the second person caused the loss, the owner can only demand payment from the first thief for the amount that it was worth at the time of the theft, or of his despair. Since both of them are thieves who must pay. No, that's. I'm going to back up to, okay, that was from Shulchan Aruch Kosher Mishpat, chapters 361. I'm going to back up into the paragraph before that I skipped over some parts. Okay, therefore the owner can, going back to the case where the owner did not despair and he's going after the third party. Therefore, the owner can demand full payment for the theft either from the first thief or from the second person, or half from each. So a lot of this depends on how the courts are going to handle this, as to who is responsible for what. Is the second thief responsible for an increased value? Is the second, in the case of theft, the thief is taking on responsibility for the necessity of returning the object, which is different from, in some ways, different from a person who inadvertently purchased an item, not realizing it was stolen. In the case of a second thief, he's also culpable for the value of the item. So basically the owner is going to go after whatever he can. The owner wants to get reimbursed for the item. And so if he gets it from the first thief or from the second thief, or the shared responsibility between the two thieves, as long as the owner gets reimbursed for the item, that's what to look for. And the courts would be figuring out what they can do with it, based upon who has the ability to repay the object, the value of the object. Likewise, if the stolen item depreciated or appreciated in value between the first theft and the transfer to the second person, the owner can demand payment from both of them. So the value owed to the original owner, you would look at either the value at the time of the theft, or if it appreciates, or the value at the time that the owner may have despaired, or the value at the time that the owner demands it back. The greater of the two sums is what's owed to the owner, as long as he did not despair. And so if it goes up or if it goes down, either way depends upon what whatever the greater of the two numbers are. He can demand repayment for both of them. So he goes to the court and he says, I'm demanding the payment from both of these people, and the owner doesn't care which one pays what amount, as long as he gets his reimbursement. For example, if the stolen item depreciated in value and the owner received payment from the second person for the value that it lessened in value after he received it from the first thief, then the owner can demand the rest of the value at the time of the theft from the first thief. If it appreciated in value, then the first thief paid the owner only the amount that it was worth at the time of theft, and the owner can demand the second person pay him the amount that it appreciated in value once it came into his hands. So the first thief is responsible for the greater of the two up until the time that he sold the item, and once he sells it to the second thief, that thief is responsible for any change in value after the object was received by him. So that the owner can go after both unless he despaired before the second person caused the loss, in which case you can only go after the first thief. Thank you.